This is a brief video clip from a conference event recorded at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., with speakers including America's 75th Attorney General, the Honorable Edwin Meese III, Honorable Becky Norton Dunlop, Natasha, Srdoc, Judge Henry Saad, and Joel Anand Samy. For the entire video, please visit Adriatic Institute's YouTube page.
Thank you, Natasha, for the invitation to be here today, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation. When judges in the United States, and specifically in Michigan, where I am an appellate judge, when we do our work, it sounds so simple after I've listened to Natasha's speech, a breach of contract between two parties, handling whether this case involves a domestic relations dispute or another case where we're applying the Miranda ruling to a confession. It almost sounds quaint when you listen to the kind of problems that Natasha's talking about. I mean, it's complex enough for judges who one day practices law, the next day puts on a robe, and then has to make some decisions about complex cases. If you, on the other hand, look at what Natasha's talking about in a country that hasn't had a history of the rule of law, a culture of the rule of law, how does one place in this soil the roots of a system that have been contaminated by a totalitarian government where it's government by men and thugs as opposed to the rule of law. That question was asked, as Natasha knows and my wife Mara knows, a number of years ago. I think it was roughly 2001. The then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Croatia convened a conference in Zagreb, and Mara asked if I would go on behalf of the ABA and the United States. There was a judge from Germany, from England, from all over the world. The president of the World Judges Conference was there. And the title of the conference that was held in Zagreb in 2001, and the Supreme Court Justice of Zagreb gave it the specific title. I remember talking to him at a dinner afterwards. He entitled it "The Centrality of the Rule of Law to the Development of a Free Market Constitutional Republic Post-Communism." And not only was the sentence complicated, but so was the subject. And he recognized, because he was a very bright fellow, how do you go from telephone justice, you will rule this way, comrade, to a system where you look at the body of law and ask the question, what does the law require us to do in this case? A law that will be equally applicable to everybody, equal justice under the law. If you haven't had that history, how do you make that shift? That's why he convened the conference. That's the question that was asked. And I remember during that conference, I read to him a quote that he was very familiar with, because he was obviously very familiar with our Constitution. And like a lot of the former Eastern Bloc countries, the ABA was working with the various institutions of justice in Eastern Europe and Slovenia and others, trying to model constitutions and frameworks of law to fit within the culture of that country. So the Chief Justice was very familiar with our Constitution and with Madison, who was the primary author. And we talked at dinner, and he said, well, what do you think, Judge Saad, is the most important thing that Madison did with respect to the Constitution? I said, I think the most important thing he did was to say what is the proper predicate to the rule of law and an independent judiciary. Because you can proclaim you have one, you can call it independent, you can say we have the rule of law. I think Russia has rule of law and constitutional language all over the place that they violate routinely, of course, and then put people in jail that they don't like. Or I think the same thing is in Zimbabwe, when Mugabe wanted certain things done, and he promised the rule of law, and when the justices of the Supreme Court didn't do what he wanted them to do, his program, he put a gun to their head and said, you will rule this way. And when they miraculously and bravely refused to do so. He just got rid of him, put in his own Supreme Court. So how do you make that conversion? And the words that we talked about that evening in Zagreb in 2001 were these. The most important thing that Madison said, and probably the quote that is most often heard from Madison is this: "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" And you know the rest of the quote about if men were angels and so forth. But that first sentence is, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature?" If you don't have as a predicate good people who want to do what is right, and instead of gaming the system or playing games with the system or circumventing the system, we see it in our own country. It's not just folks in Croatia who are in jail. I mean, we have 2 ex-Illinois governors who are in federal prison. It happens everywhere. But we know that in the United States, the rule of law is taking some hits. I don't have to detail what they are. Everybody in this room knows what they are. When the rule of law is circumvented here, there are institutions like Heritage and Hoover and others who try to do something about it, take great pains to do something about it, to bring it out, to litigate it, and there are good organizations who, when they see somebody circumventing the rule of law, if they can't get it through Congress, let's slip it through their administrative agency, and there's litigation. Except if you don't have that fail-safe of litigation of an independent judiciary in the rule of law, as Natasha meant, then where do you go? Of course, if your judiciary is also working hand in hand with the very people who are trying to circumvent the law, then you got a problem. And so when we were in Zagreb in 2001, and we read that statement again, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, therefore, as Madison did as the primary author of that and the Federalist Papers," he went on to say, "in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men," and I'm sure he meant that generically, not in a sexist way, "the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." And what controls are there on the judiciary other than judicial restraint? Because if I get a case and I think, you know, I disagree with this policy of the governor or the legislature, or if I'm in the federal system of Congress, if I disagree, I will find it unconstitutional. How? Well, I'll just pretend it's unconstitutional. I'll figure out a way. If that is my mindset, if I don't comply with what is the heart of the constitutional provisions for judges, that is to interpret the law, not to make it up or to make up just to comply with your own will, then the judiciary is not much of a check. So even in a system of laws with an independent judiciary, which we have in the United States, there are significant problems. You go back to Croatia in 2001, and when the fundamental question asked is, do we even have people who understand this, who will hear the words and actually feel what needs to be done? If telephone justice continues, if you have, let's say, 50 judges who are used to telephone justice as opposed to the rule of law, and then they say, okay, now we have a constitution, now we have the rule of law, and 48 of the 50 are still communists who just changed their suits, and they're still doing telephone justice, they're just calling it by a different name, nothing much is going to happen. So that is, and people ask, well, how is it that, I was talking with a gentleman last night about the rule of law in Afghanistan, and he said, yes, some people doing contracts in Afghanistan, very large contracts, said, yes, we talk about the rule of law, they understand contract is all for acceptance and consideration, and then they'll say, okay, now how do you pay me off? Give me my money, give me my bribe. And the person I was talking to said, well, remember, we're talking about the rule of law, which says offer, accept. Yes, that's all very good, I agree. Now, give me my money, give me my bribe. And he said that, sadly, those who understand the rule of law and know its importance and who are very bright, good people in Afghanistan are getting out of Dodge because they know that that's not going to work in Afghanistan because it's still tribal, it's still payoffs, it's still thugocracy, it's not the rule of law, it's not people seeking to do good and the public good. So that's the problem there. What is the problem in a lot of the Eastern European countries where the ABA has put together constitutional frameworks? It goes to the heart of the question of the character of the people who are going to apply that law. You can have all the documents in the world, and if people say, all right, now how do I game the system? I'm going to put a gun to somebody's head who's a judge, as you were referring to, and maybe not physically, but the point, they understand the point, the threats to their life, their families, and so forth. Extremely, extremely difficult. Nonetheless, how are you going to get it done other than education? And it's teaching new generations and getting people involved who have the courage, the discipline, the goodwill, the heart, the soul, the belief in God and country, faith and family. All the things that we know make things work here. You have to do that to make it work there. The organic documents of our country, the 4 organic documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the Northwest Ordinance, which comprise, as we know, fundamentally the organic documents of our country and the source of our constitutional law, our free market republic. Interestingly, understood precisely that if you did not have a moral base, if you did not have good people, you could put together all the checks and balances and federalism and so forth, and it was not going to work. Fundamental to all that is educating your people about the importance of faith, family. And in the Northwest Ordinance, those of us who love that document, let me go to what they say. They considered education to be very important to the process, and it is. If you don't have it, if you don't educate the next group of people who will be administering the laws, the judges, it's not going to work. But in essence, what it says is that to have good government, you have to have religion, you have to have faith, you have to have love of country, and it has to be taught to your children. And it has to be part of your culture, part of your nature, part of your national sovereignty, your DNA. And the Northwest Ordinance, which was the first to establish actually areas to have where the government gave property to have education for children, in essence said, if you want good government and the happiness of your people, you must first educate them to understand about morality and faith and family. So I'm a judge, not a philosopher or a moralist, but I know that as I see doing my job every day, as I see other judges doing their job, it is very easy to slip from those bounds of what you know to be right and do something wrong. Most people know the difference between right and wrong. It's a choice. It's a fundamental choice. And you look back to our conference in Zagreb in 2001, and there were a lot of people who wanted the right thing to happen. They didn't want telephone justice. They wanted precedent. They wanted the rule of law, where everybody plays by the same rules, because if they don't, it devolves into the law of the jungle. I've watched since then what's happened in Croatia, and I'm an optimist by nature, and I know that in our country it didn't happen overnight. Folks arrived here in about 1500 or so, and about 1800 or so, 300 years later, we start putting together a fairly concrete structure for constitutional law. But in the last couple hundred years, it's been worked on and improved, and with problems. So I don't know how long Zagreb has been independent. Natasha, what is it, 1991? Relatively new. And I think as long as people like you do the kind of work you do and your husband, and with the help of your institute and Heritage, which does such wonderful work, and others throughout the United States and throughout the world who care about what happens. Witness what's going on in Kiev. I mean, they're out there in the streets it's the Orange Revolution again. No, you should not put a gun to our head to say that we can't have freedom, and people stand up for that. It takes courage, it takes character, it takes morality. The judges who do the job are, to me, a very small part of that. Our job is to understand the limits of our role. The legislature makes the law. We should interpret the law. Everyone in the United States who takes the bench, whether it's federal or state, the only requirement is that they put their hand on the Constitution and swear to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not any other document, just the Constitution of the United States. I say just, but that is the key. That's what the president does. That's what every judge does, state or federal. That's the heart of it. And when you take that oath, you have to be true to your oath, true to your word. I'm glad there are people like you working to try to make sure that happens in Croatia. And maybe 10 years from now we'll have this conference again, look back and say they've made a lot of progress. I hope so. Thank you for letting me be here. But this Northwest Ordinance was being written at the same time of the Constitution, which is why it's regarded as one of our organic founding documents. And to Joel's point, is the third article of the Northwest Ordinance declares, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged, and of course they funded them. But again, that's the predicate that Madison was talking about, if men were angels, but government is a reflection of the people. So the more you have people who want to do good, who believe in the rule of law, not just utter the words, but actually believe in it. And that takes education. You can't, if it's so difficult to convince the world about what we have or our children, then maybe we have not been doing a good job in educating our own so that they can then continue, as Reagan said, which is one generation away from losing liberties, because he understood that just words on paper don't matter. It has to be in your DNA.
This is a brief video clip from a conference event recorded at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., with speakers including America's 75th Attorney General, the Honorable Edwin Meese III, Honorable Becky Norton Dunlop, Natasha, Srdoc, Judge Henry Saad, and Anand Samy. For the entire video, please visit Adriatic Institute's YouTube page.